Dr. Gerald Whitmore was known throughout Seattle not only for his decades of service as a respected heart surgeon but also for his quiet love of solitude and the outdoors. After retiring at the age of 68, he spent most of his free time exploring the Pacific Northwest, hiking forest trails, camping under the stars, and keeping detailed journals about everything from birds he spotted to plants he encountered. He was a man of routine, discipline, and self-reliance, traits that had served him well both in the operating room and in the wild. In early August, he informed his daughter, Julia, that he would be taking a solo hiking trip through Mount Rainier National Park, a place he had visited many times before. He emailed her a copy of his planned route, a 5-day loop trail that included the more remote northern loop, known for its stunning views and fewer tourists. He told her not to worry, that he had done this hike multiple times, and that he would call as soon as he got back to cell service on Sunday afternoon. Sunday came. No call. At first, Julia wasn't alarmed. Maybe his phone died, or he'd extended the trip by a day. It wouldn't have been the first time. But by Monday morning, panic began to take hold. She contacted the Park Service, who confirmed that Dr. Whitmore had checked in at the trailhead but had not signed out. His car was still parked at the designated lot, untouched. By noon, rangers had launched a preliminary search. By nightfall, a full-scale rescue mission was underway. For the next 7 days, dozens of search and rescue personnel scoured the area. Helicopters flew overhead. Search dogs combed the trails. Volunteers on foot checked caves, stream beds, ravines, anywhere a hiker might fall or shelter. They found only one possible clue. A single right-hand hiking glove, dark green, found snagged on a low bush near a steep drop-off. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No backpack, food wrappers, or clothing. It was as if he had simply walked off the trail and disappeared into the forest. Friends and former colleagues were stunned. Julia appeared on local news stations, pleading for information. Flyers went up. Tips came in, but none panned out. There were no known enemies. No deaths. No signs of foul play. He hadn't been suffering from dementia or confusion. By all accounts, he was in excellent physical and mental health for his age. After 2 weeks, the official search was called off. Dr. Whitmore was declared missing, presumed dead. But to those who knew him best, especially Julia, something didn't feel right. Her father had once said, "If anything ever happens to me in the wild, don't assume it was the end. Nature always leaves clues, if you know how to look." At the time, it had sounded like philosophy. Now, it felt like a challenge. In the days following Gerald Whitmore's disappearance, the rescue effort escalated into one of the most comprehensive searches Mount Rainier National Park had seen in years. The terrain was difficult: dense alpine forest, slippery shale ridges, glacial rivers that twisted unpredictably through valleys. But Whitmore's experience and the fact that he had left a planned route gave rescuers hope. They followed his intended loop trail in small teams, expanding the radius with each day that passed. Helicopters flew low and slow, scanning the forest canopy and meadows with thermal imaging equipment, hoping to catch any trace of body heat or movement. Dogs were deployed along the trail in hopes of picking up his scent, but the rains that had hit the area 2 days after he vanished had likely washed away most traces. Despite that, searchers remained persistent. Every ravine, creek, and outcropping was checked. Areas near cliffs were examined with drones. The only physical evidence remained that single green glove, which his daughter confirmed had belonged to him, part of a pair she had gifted him the previous Christmas. News of the disappearance spread quickly, especially within the medical community. Former colleagues from the hospital, fellow hikers, and even former patients joined the volunteer effort. For 2 weeks, people took shifts combing the woods, calling his name, and leaving markers along the trail for any sign of life. Julia never left the area. She camped in the ranger station parking lot, waiting for updates, reviewing maps, praying that each day would bring a new clue. But every evening ended the same, empty-handed. Park officials began to grow grim. Statistically, the chances of survival after 7 days in the wilderness, especially for someone in their late 60s, were slim. Yet they couldn't ignore how prepared Gerald had been. He carried a satellite compass, emergency thermal blankets, iodine tablets for water purification, and a week's worth of supplies. Still, no sign of a campfire, a tent, or discarded wrappers was found. Then came the theories. A few hikers had reported seeing an older man walking off trail near the Carbon River area, several miles from Gerald's planned path, around the time of his disappearance. It was an odd detour, but not impossible. Others speculated that he may have fallen into a remote cave or been buried in a rockslide. One man at a local lodge even suggested something more sinister: "You don't just vanish like that. Not a man like him. Maybe someone wanted him gone." That theory rattled Julia. Could someone have harmed her father? Or was he injured, possibly alive, waiting for help that never came? Despite the growing doubts, Julia refused to believe he had simply perished. She remembered how, after her mother's death, her father had taken up survival training as a way of coping. "Nature doesn't scare me," he had said once. "The forest is honest. It only takes what you're not willing to respect." 4 weeks into the search, the team scaled back. Official efforts ceased. The forest swallowed up its silence once again, and Dr. Gerald Whitmore became a name etched on a list of the forever missing. But the mountain had not yet told its full story. As the seasons changed and the initial media frenzy faded, the story of Dr. Gerald Whitmore's disappearance slowly slipped from public memory, but not from the minds of those who had known and loved him. For Julia, his only daughter, the unanswered questions became a haunting echo in her daily life. She would often sit by her window late into the night, staring out at the dark, wooded hills near her home, wondering what the forest might still be holding onto. With no body, no clear evidence, and no farewell, the vacuum left behind gave rise to whispers and theories, some rational, others strange and unsettling. The first theory that began to circulate in local circles was the simplest: that Dr. Whitmore had lost his footing in one of the steep ravines, suffered a fatal fall, and his body had become entangled in the underbrush or washed away by one of the powerful streams fed by melting glaciers. Nature was unforgiving, and even experienced hikers had vanished under such circumstances. But for a man known for his precision, planning, and caution, many, including Julia, found it hard to accept. Then came the darker speculation. Online forums dedicated to cold cases picked up the story, and amateur sleuths began connecting dots that may not have even existed. One theory suggested that Dr. Whitmore had staged his own disappearance. Some believed he might have been running from something, guilt, perhaps, tied to an old surgical case gone wrong. They unearthed a malpractice lawsuit he'd faced over a decade ago, long since dismissed. Still, the idea stuck with some. Maybe he wanted to disappear and start over. Another theory spun in the opposite direction: that he had been silenced. A few commenters claimed he had recently been consulting with a journalist about unethical practices he'd witnessed during his medical career. There were rumors of a tell-all memoir, though no evidence of a manuscript was ever found. The idea that he had been targeted added a sinister layer to his story, and it gained traction with those hungry for conspiracy. But the most unsettling reports came from a handful of hikers and locals who swore they had seen a man-matching drive Whitmore's description well after he was presumed dead. One woman, a backpacker from Oregon, claimed she had briefly spoken with a soft-spoken older man near Mystic Lake, weeks after his disappearance. He told her he had lost his way, and was heading north, then disappeared into the trees before she could ask more. She only realized who he might have been when she saw his photo on a flyer later that evening pinned to a trailhead board. Another reported sighting came from a ranger stationed in a remote lookout post who recalled seeing an old man through binoculars sitting beside a fire in a clearing deep in the forest. The fire was gone by morning, and no sign of the man was found when the area was later searched. Though none of these reports could be confirmed, they gave Julia a strange hope, and deepened the mystery. If he had survived, why hadn't he returned? Was he injured and unable to get help? Had he chosen to live off the grid in solitude? Theories continued to swirl, and with each year that passed, the legend of the doctor who disappeared began to settle into local folklore. Campers told the story around fires. Some hikers claimed they felt watched near the spot where his glove had been found. Others said they heard strange tapping sounds in the woods at night, like someone signaling in Morse code. But for Julia, these weren't ghost stories. They were possibilities. She wasn't interested in legends, she wanted truth. And while the forest remained silent, she clung to the belief that it hadn't given up its final answer yet. 4 years had passed since Gerald Whitmore disappeared without a trace. The seasons had cycled through their patterns, harsh winters blanketing Mount Rainier in snow, vibrant springs returning life to the forest floor, and golden autumns casting long shadows over the trails he once walked. His name had faded from headlines and his photograph, once posted on trail signs and bulletin boards, had become sun-bleached and forgotten. But the mountain had not forgotten. It was early summer when a team of wildlife researchers from a nearby university arrived at the northern edge of the park. Their project focused on ecological restoration and, more specifically, the behavior of beavers in reforestation zones. The animals were known for their industrious dam building, which could dramatically alter landscapes, redirecting waterways, creating wetlands, and even shifting patterns of local plant growth. One of the more remote creeks, known to few hikers, had become the site of several unusually large beaver dams that the researchers wanted to study. As the team trekked through the forest, hauling equipment and making notes on tree markings and water levels, one of the students pointed out a particularly enormous structure wedged between two fallen logs near the banks of a slow-moving stream. The dam was massive, clearly the product of years of work. Water trickled gently through the sticks and mud that had been woven together with astonishing complexity. Curious about the dam's construction and contents, the group began carefully examining the outer layers. It was then that someone noticed something odd lodged in the upper right portion of the structure, something that didn't belong. At first glance, it appeared to be a piece of fabric, faded and darkened by time and exposure. As they pulled away layers of sticks and wet leaves, more pieces began to surface. A strap, the corner of a metal case, the gleam of rusted hinges. The team froze. What they uncovered, buried in the heart of the beaver dam, was unmistakably a leather medical bag. Old, weather-worn, but intact. Its sides were scuffed, the handle cracked, but the initials, GW, were faintly visible on a brass plate bolted to its front. Inside the bag were items that chilled them to the core: a half-rotted stethoscope, surgical scissors dulled with rust, a faded cloth pouch containing bandages, and, most importantly, a waterproof envelope sealed with tape. There were also photographs, water-damaged but identifiable, of a young girl and a woman, and a small folded map of Mount Rainier with handwritten notes in the margins. The researchers immediately stopped their work and notified the park authorities. Rangers arrived within hours, cordoning off the area and collecting the bag as evidence. It was confirmed that the initials matched those of Dr. Gerald Whitmore, and Julia, who had never changed her phone number in hopes of someday being contacted, was called and asked to come to the park headquarters. News of the discovery spread quickly. After years of silence, the case was suddenly open again. The forest had spoken at last, not through a skeleton in the open, but through the quiet work of a beaver, unknowingly entombing part of a man's last days within its dam. For Julia, the call felt both like a spark of hope and a punch to the chest. Her father's bag, out there in the wild, waiting all this time to be found, meant one thing for certain: he had survived for at least some time after disappearing. But what happened after he left that bag behind? Why had it ended up in a beaver dam? And most of all, what would they find next? When Julia arrived at the ranger station, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the treetops that lined the parking lot. She stepped out of her car slowly, the air thick with anticipation, fear, and a fragile strand of hope. In her hand, she clutched the photo she'd never stopped carrying: her father, in his hiking gear, smiling beside her at the base of Mount Rainier during one of their last camping trips together. It was that memory she held onto as she approached the office, heart pounding. Inside, a park official greeted her quietly and led her to a table where the medical bag lay sealed in a protective evidence bag. Time had worn it down, the leather cracked and stained by years of exposure. Yet Julia recognized it immediately. She reached out with trembling fingers, not to touch it, but just to feel the weight of the moment. Tears welled in her eyes. "He never went anywhere without it," she whispered. The ranger nodded. "There's more," he said, carefully laying out the contents of the bag one by one. Each item felt like a breadcrumb leading back into the past: his old compass, still faintly etched with his initials; the waterproof envelope, now dried and carefully preserved; and the photographs, her graduation picture and one of her mother, both warped by water but unmistakable. But it was the map that pulled Julia's focus. It was hand-folded, yellowed, and marked with a red pen. Beside the circled location deep within the park's northern backcountry were scrawled words in her father's handwriting: "Shelter here. Injured. May return later." Julia's breath caught. Injured. He'd been alive. He had made it somewhere, possibly even set up camp. She clung to the note like it was a message in a bottle cast from the past. Her father had left a clue, not for rescuers but perhaps for himself, or for her, if she ever found it. The implications sank in. Her father hadn't vanished instantly. He had survived, long enough to write a note, long enough to create a shelter. He hadn't just walked into the woods to die. He had fought to live. And perhaps, he had hoped someone would follow the trail he left. The Beaver Dam, it seemed, had unknowingly become a time capsule. According to wildlife biologists, beavers often use whatever they can find in their environment to build and reinforce their dams. The leather bag, likely abandoned or washed downstream, had been just another sturdy object in their eyes, perfect for their needs. But to Julia, it was a message across years of silence. The park rangers agreed to reopen the investigation, this time focusing on the coordinates indicated on the map. Julia insisted on going with them. No longer content to sit on the sidelines of the mystery that had consumed her for 4 years, she was ready to face the mountain herself. As preparations began for a new search team, Julia stood outside and stared up at the distant ridgelines of Mount Rainier. The sun had now fully set, but the sky burned with the last light of dusk. For the first time in years, she didn't feel lost. She felt called. Her father had left her a trail, one she was finally ready to follow. The following morning, the air was crisp as Julia stood at the base of the trail, outfitted in borrowed ranger gear. She wasn't alone. A team of seasoned search and rescue professionals accompanied her, along with a park biologist familiar with the terrain and a forensic consultant from the sheriff's office. This time, the search wasn't a desperate blind sweep. It was focused, informed, and driven by a tangible lead. The coordinates marked on her father's map led deep into a part of the park known for its unforgiving terrain, a section overgrown with bramble and shielded by towering evergreens. Few hikers ventured there. It had no maintained trails, and the route was steep, damp, and littered with fallen logs and moss-covered rocks. But that only reinforced Julia's belief. Her father, even injured, had made it there. It was exactly the kind of hidden place he would have chosen if he needed shelter, quiet, hard to find, and close to water. Hours passed as they made their way through the thick underbrush, occasionally checking the GPS coordinates on handheld devices. As they climbed higher, the forest changed, thinner trees, clearer light, and the quiet stillness of a place long undisturbed. Then, one of the team members called out. They had found something. Tucked beneath a rocky overhang partially shielded by ferns and fallen limbs was a small, weathered lean-to. It had clearly been constructed with care, sticks woven between forked branches, insulated with bark and pine needles. The structure had mostly collapsed, but traces of its shape remained. Nearby, a fire ring, long cold, still held blackened stones and the rusted remains of a cooking tin. A faded thermal blanket lay tangled in the brush. Julia moved in slowly, her heart in her throat. Inside the shelter, among decaying leaves and debris, they discovered remnants of a man's presence, a pair of worn boots, a plastic water purification straw, and, tucked inside a crevice in the rock wall, a notebook sealed in a plastic bag. Hands shaking, Julia opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's. Inside were pages dated weeks after his disappearance. They began with field observations, notes on local flora, weather patterns, and pain in his leg, which he described as likely fractured. Then, the entries grew more personal. He wrote of his injury slowing him, his inability to reach higher ground, and how he rationed food. He mentioned the hope that someone would find the map he left behind. One entry struck Julia the hardest. If Julia finds this, I didn't give up. I fought. I tried. And I'm sorry I couldn't come back. I love you always, Dad. Tears blurred her vision as she read it aloud to the team. No one spoke for a long while. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Though no remains were found in the shelter, the notebook confirmed the impossible: drive. Gerald Whitmore had survived for at least several weeks, maybe longer. He had endured, alone, injured, and isolated, but had not lost his clarity of mind, nor his will to live. And he had never stopped thinking about his daughter. For Julia, it wasn't closure in the traditional sense. Her father's body was still missing. But what she now carried was deeper, the knowledge that he hadn't simply vanished into mystery. He had lived his final days with resilience, grace, and purpose. He had left behind a message not just of survival, but of love. And she had finally followed his footsteps to the end of the trail. The journey down from the shelter site was quiet. The team moved slowly, each person deep in thought, the weight of discovery settling heavily in their bones. Julia clutched the sealed notebook against her chest like it was something sacred, and in a way, it was. Not just proof that her father had lived beyond the day he disappeared, but a final conversation between them, stitched together in his own shaky handwriting. It was as close to a goodbye as she would ever get. Once back at the ranger station, the atmosphere shifted from solemn discovery to methodical analysis. The shelter, the contents of the bag, and especially the journal were all now part of an active investigation. Though no human remains had been found, the park authorities promised to comb the area around the lean-to thoroughly in the days ahead, searching for any trace of Dr. Whitmore's final resting place. Julia agreed, but something inside her had already begun to settle, not with certainty, but with peace. The news spread quickly. Local headlines picked up the story. Break-in 4-year mystery of missing doctor on Mount Rainier. Reporters swarmed the ranger station, eager for interviews and images. Julia, however, declined to speak publicly. She wasn't interested in fueling speculation or turning her father's story into spectacle. For 4 years she had lived with questions, with theories that painted him as careless, suicidal, or even secretive. Now she knew the truth, he had been none of those things. He had been a man lost to nature, not to shame or secrets. In private, Julia sat down with her father's journal again, this time reading every word by lamplight in the ranger guest cabin. The entries, dated sporadically over a span of what looked like 5 to 7 weeks, painted a vivid portrait of a man trying to outlast the wilderness. He tracked the days with scratch marks on the rock wall. He treated his leg as best he could. He captured rainwater, foraged for edible plants, and rationed the last of his trail bars. In one entry, he described hearing helicopters and flashing his emergency mirror, but the thick tree cover made him invisible. He wrote about dreams, of sitting on the porch with Julia, of hearing music from the house again, of his late wife calling to him through the trees. He fought against loneliness with thoughts of his daughter, and in the margins of several pages, her name appeared, scrawled again and again like a mantra. Julia, Julia, Julia. It was clear he had hoped. Even near the end, he was waiting for a miracle. Later that evening, one of the rangers knocked quietly on her door. They had found something else. A second, much older beaver dam, farther upstream, had collapsed after recent rains. Among the tangled mess of branches and silt, a piece of torn jacket sleeve had been discovered, the same make and model her father wore the day he went missing. Though it wasn't definitive, the implication was strong. At some point after leaving the shelter, he had tried to move. Perhaps to find help. Perhaps to find her. The forest, bit by bit, was giving back what it had taken. Julia walked out to the stream near the guest cabin that night and sat by the water. The stars above the mountains blinked like distant messages. The air was still, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of trees or a distant owl call. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the mountain was hiding something from her. She felt like it had finally answered. Months passed, but the discovery on Mount Rainier never left Julia's mind, or her heart. After returning home, she tried to resume her life, but everything felt different. The world had shifted. Her father's absence no longer felt like a void filled with unanswered questions, but like a room full of silent understanding. He was gone, yes, but he hadn't vanished into nothingness. He had left behind a trail, a truth, and most importantly, a legacy that she was only beginning to understand. Julia began to write, not just journal entries, as she had in the early days of his disappearance, but something deeper, structured, intentional, and filled with emotion. She wrote about her father's love for the outdoors, his quiet determination, his brilliance as a physician, and the simple, powerful bond they had shared over childhood camping trips and evenings studying the stars. Page by page, memory by memory, she pieced together not just his story, but hers as well. The story of a daughter who refused to give up, who searched mountains, chased whispers in the trees, and found not just the truth, but herself. She turned the journal into a manuscript. She didn't care if it was published, though eventually, it would be. What mattered was that she was telling the story the right way, not how others speculated. No wild theories. No mystery for mystery's sake. Just a man, a mountain, and the enduring tether of family. The park rangers kept in touch. Though no human remains were ever found, the lean-to and surrounding area were marked as a protected site, not a tourist attraction but a space of quiet remembrance. In a small, respectful ceremony attended only by Julia, a few rangers, and the research team who found the bag, a memorial plaque was placed at the site. It read, "In memory of Dr. Gerald Whitmore, he walked into the wild with purpose, and left behind love, courage, and the strength to endure." Later that fall, Julia returned to the site alone. It took her most of the day to hike the rough trail, and though the climb was grueling, it filled her with a strange sense of peace. When she reached the collapsed lean-to, the woods were silent again, just as they had been when her father lay beneath the canopy, waiting and hoping. She sat on a rock near the site and opened the small leather-bound journal he had left behind. Though she had memorized every word, she read it again, slowly, as the sun sank behind the ridge. When she finished, she pulled a new notebook from her pack and began to write a letter, not to herself, or the world, but to him. She told him about the search. About the dam. About the moment she found his words and finally understood how hard he had fought. She told him she loved him. That she forgave him for not coming back. And that she had finally stopped waiting. Not because she gave up, but because she found what she was meant to, not just answers but his voice. As twilight faded into night, Julia placed the new notebook beside the plaque and whispered a final goodbye. The mountain, always listening, stayed silent, but she no longer needed it to speak. She had heard all she needed in the pages he left behind, and in the quiet strength of his final act, surviving as long as he could, leaving behind a message of love, and trusting that one day, she would find her way to him. And she had.